thank you so much for joining in our conversation that we've been having regarding our shaping safer online spaces. And this is our first episode, and we're launching with the amazing Kirthi Jayakumar, who we've had the privilege of knowing since the past year, as we held a webinar with IPPF on just addressing digital safety for feminists and SRHR activists online. So yeah, thank you so much, Kirthi, for joining in and for taking out the time. Yeah, I'll just start with, just introductions, and if you can share a bit about yourself to our viewers, who are just listening in.
Thank you so much for having me here. I think it's a delight just to be able to share space with you, whether that's online or even in our exchanges on social media. So thank you for this space to share and learn from you. So as you know, my name is Kirthi and I live and work in Chennai. I consider myself as a bit of a magpie, which means that I'm always after shiny objects and trying to learn new things. In terms of education, I have a law degree and 2 master's degrees in peace and conflict studies, which has led me to multiple paths of confusion. I have never litigated as a traditional legal professional would, mainly because I didn't really see much in the legal system that drew me to stay put. I came out kicking and screaming, feeling justice being denied more than being offered. So I stepped away from that track, started volunteering with the UN online volunteering system, worked with several NGOs, including ASAP Asia for a very brief window. And all of these experiences taught me the fact that no matter where you are in the world, the chips are always stacked up against you based on your gender, unless you're a cis-het man, which means that the people in charge are way fewer in number than the people in whom they are charged of, to a self-assumed sense of entitlement. So that led me down, again, multiple paths. I founded a nonprofit in 2013 to start working with young people to really dissociate from violence as the norm. And what started with young people became about working with the village that raises every child. So I worked with their teachers, I worked with their parents. I experienced mindset shifts within as I did see them happen without in spaces that I engaged with. Somewhere along the way, there was a deep sense of trust that several of these young people and their parents built with me. So they would reach out and ask for support in cases of domestic violence and other forms of gender-based violence. So that led me down to coding an app in the form of a tech tool to place in the hands of folks for whom speaking up and asking for help directly is not always easy, as you and I both know. So that was a different route. And all of this sort of reached a bit of a peak during the COVID pandemic, especially given that everybody was holding up in very limited spaces. When I say limited space, I'm not talking about the size of one's place, but really just the fact that movement was restricted. And that automatically meant that folks who could get out of dangerous situations had no way out. So with the pandemic, the upshot of violence also translated into an upshot of the use of the app and other related resources, which I think is also what brought you and me together. I apologize for the WhatsApp ding there, but this is as natural as it gets, I reckon. But that aside, I recently, at the start of the pandemic, founded the Gender Security Project, which is a switched gear looking at feminist foreign policy and women peace security from the majority world, which the global north insists on calling the global south. But the idea here is really to position narratives that have been elbowed out of history with the white pursuit of, let me qualify that, a hashtag. So where you have white governments insisting that they have feminist foreign policies, you're basically looking at what I'd like to call lipstick on a pig. Things that they have done in the past to support women's health are now just being, these were traditional ways of doing aid for a while, but they are now calling that feminist foreign policy. When the truth is, any feminist foreign policy would, in my books at least, and several feminist books in that sense of the term, would call for the dismantling of war, not try to make war safer for women. So when you have a country that is telling you that we are supporting women's education in a developing country elsewhere from us, we're also murdering indigenous women here, we're also supplying weapons to countries that are at war, I don't see any feminist foreign policy being done. So that's where I am at, Aisha. You get the sense of being a magpie, a lost one at that, but a trying one at that.
No, yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And I think this was just so inspiring to listen to you and to hear your journey. I think you've just achieved so many. and not to as in just appreciate for the sake of it, but for someone to have that, realization of starting off as a lawyer and then introspecting and then realizing, there are certain things, there are certain gaps that need to be bridged, and then taking the initiative, being that, Dr. Galvi always says it's called the call of the hero. Initially, they're sort of just, reluctant and found at a different place, but their journey is completely something else. So I think that's what it sounds like for us, and I think in great worked out for us. I think that's why how we are connected. So so glad. Then moving on to learning coding yourself and just taking action, realizing that there's something wrong and just taking action on that, and what can I do. So again, something extremely, we want to learn from. That you believe that gender inequality is sort of the biggest domino that, which is stopping a lot of good from happening in general. And if you could share a bit about that. I mean, you've sort of, having worked in different fields in your life, how did you, even as a lawyer or, while being in the UN, and like you mentioned about the whole politics of how the policy framework of so-called the white countries and their outlook towards the developing countries or the South or the Asia. And so in all of these circumstances, in these contexts.
Thank you for asking that, because it's also made me really think very deeply about what the past 12 years have looked like. And, you have these moments when you look back and think, goodness, this has just been going on for too long, right? And so that the moments that you were asking, there's so many incidents just flashed past in my mind's eye. Now, the one thing that struck me very honestly is I've had 18 years of a lived experience that I kept very quiet about until I turned 25. And in a nutshell, just in the interest of making sure that I don't trigger anyone, every piece of those 18 years of a lived experience centered on some form of violence to my person or to my mind. And all of that violence was done to my person or my mind because of my identity. An identity as a cishet woman, an identity as a woman bearing particular aspects. For instance, a disabled woman in one context, a woman belonging to a certain community in one context, a woman speaking a certain language in one context. But the denominator that I realized here was that I was a woman. Now, in organizations that I volunteered with through the UN volunteering system, and then after that, just when I literally went on my magpie-like journey, I found that women and non-binary people continued to face these violences. And why I think that the gender-based domino is the biggest one over here is no matter what formula you apply. In the Rwandan genocide, which was in the context of targeting the Tutsi people by the Hutus, this was there. This was a very significant dynamic. In the Congo, which is near Rwanda, women were constantly being raped in order for conflict minerals to be mined. And those minerals went into making our phones and our laptops, which we probably continue to use even now because we don't have a way to check supply chains as ordinary people. Cut from there all the way to, say, Afghanistan. Young women were prevented from accessing education. Young boys were vulnerable to sexual abuse through several practices. And then any individual who fell outside the mold of boy and girl was anomalized and in several instances even stoned. These narratives look different in terms of what they manifest as. But the base that you see here is that gender is a divisor. Gender is being the basis for some people to assume power over other individuals. And you see that even now in the so-called developed countries of the world, you have a small coterie of white men sitting behind locked doors, writing a subversive draft of a judgment to subvert a judgment that has kept women's rights in place for long. And I was reading a meme which really hit me hard, which is that American women today have fewer rights than their grandmothers did, which is something to think about, right? And we're all looking at these countries as developed. Now, right now, as we're speaking, there's so much attention going to the war in Ukraine and how women are being sexually violenced on a daily basis. But this has been the narrative in Palestine, in Kashmir, in Northeast India, and right now in South Sudan, Tigray, and Yemen, which are not getting airtime in the media. So what the understanding of the gender domino is would be incomplete if we don't see the intersectionalities that continue to operate. So whereas an American woman and I are equally vulnerable to sexual violence, she still enjoys certain privileges over me that her identity as an American woman brings to her place. Now, if she's a white American woman, her privileges are far higher. if she's a Black American woman, her oppression is far, far, far more than mine. Me here in India as an upper caste, a Savarna woman, sitting here before you with a functional internet connection in the middle of a heat wave, but with ways to manage that, I'm super privileged in comparison with several women who are divided from me in terms of caste lines, in terms of religious lines, in terms of linguistic lines, class lines. And if we are not accounting for the ways in which our lives are fractured as a society, then anything we do by way of addressing the environment, addressing the economy, addressing education will fail. These are projects that are going to be dead on arrival if we don't acknowledge that every action that we are offering will never reach the last mile unless we're willing to be intersectional about our approach. So it's so easy, right? Like if I create tomorrow, if I'm the prime minister of this country and I come up with a scheme saying 50% of every education institution will be reserved for women, I shall tell me what women will sit in these classrooms, women who already have privilege.
Privilege, yeah.
Now, I'm just going to think my job is done. I've fulfilled SDG 5 on track, amazing. But I'm creating content for a stand-up comedian to rile me up, honestly. But the essence of this is lost, like an educational policy that's offering women who can pay for this education, women who can access this education, and still continuing to keep women who cannot access this education, non-binary people who will simply not even find themselves in this system. I failed. So unless we knock the gender domino down and along with it really take down all the intersectional divisions, I mean, just think of it as the center of the cobweb, no? You pull it out, then look at all the worlds that you're exposing behind that.
I could not agree more to that. And I think the point about gender along with intersectionality is something that, we're constantly now reminded of. And I think that was something we're learning along the way, and we're as privileged as as you said, privileged feminists ourselves as well. I think we are unlearning certain things, and because even when you look at even in the subcontinent context, it's really about controlling the reproductive sort of aspects of women. And even when you look at again another dimension of inequality, which is caste, something very prominent, and again something even on religious lines, you constantly, some way or the other, you see it being connected to sort of caste privilege, or maintaining a sort of lineage or sort of blood purity. And that is why again then you see that intercaste marriages or inter-religious marriages also something that is because it all depends on the offspring, which again has to be a male, because then the passage of property and resources has to be like that, right? Because so I absolutely, like, I think these are some things that you see gender, and personally I see reproductive the reproductive function of like sexuality of a woman being more sort of at the center of all of the conflict and the issues that are there. And I think if you really unpack the layers, you'll find that that gender disparity or that patriarchy being the source of it all, or the power imbalance or the hierarchies that exist. I think we need to constantly keep questioning our privilege and make sure that as we move forward, we do it along with all of the community members, all of the identities that have been left behind, even by the feminist movement themselves. Thanks a lot for that. So yeah, moving on to the next question. You have been you've also previously mentioned that worked with ASAP. I think few years back. So when you started your journey with ASAP, which is an abortion rights organization, to now here we are, where we are having this conversation about building a safer online space for safe abortion advocates. And in your journey of from being associated with this abortion rights movement to now, what are the kind of sort of changes, developments, or setbacks have you seen in the movement, in the network within itself? And again, looking at in context of, because that's something that you've been working on, in context of conflict-ridden areas, where do you feel that SRHR or abortion access or contraceptive access, all of these find a place in the in conflict-ridden areas, or even the conversations of so-called peace building? How you see the abortion rights movement progressing?
I think it's been a good 8 years since I worked at ASAP, and I have the most beautiful memories of being there. And it was a very short window, but I think I learned a lot in that process. And some of these lessons, of course, continue to remain with you, right? It's being a feminist is being a verb. So much of that verb is involved in my memories with ASAP as well. Now, in the 8 years, I'll have to tell you that I I don't have the experience or the wisdom to say that there has been a change in these ways or there has not been a change in these ways. I think time will enable more of that wisdom. But what I can say is that in terms of my own journey, both personally and professionally, I've noticed a few things that to me look like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but we're still 1 step forward, to quote Rosa Diaz from, I think, Brooklyn Nine-Nine. But also in terms of the fact that the more things change, the more things stay the same. So it's a bit of a paradox, tension of the opposites, and holding some of that as we walk along. Now, over the time that I started work until today, the one big, beautiful, positive change is moments like these, you and I having a conversation. So much of that, I'm not saying would not have been possible, because that's huge disrespect to our grandmothers and mothers and sisters and aunts who have held space with each other, just not in an electronic format.
Yeah.
But I think the tipping point right now is that this beautiful medium, and this devastating medium at the same time, is such a currency that we have, so that our voices sitting here can be heard miles away. Now, in some ways, that's a beautiful thing, because it also creates room for people who did not have these spaces to articulate, to find spaces to articulate, audiences to articulate to, and people to respond and act on what they have heard. But naturally, and the drawback is inherent in this, is that any space you open up, and that too with a very patriarchal blueprint, because we all know that the internet originated as a militarized tool. It was ARPANET in the American system. So it does have a cell memory of being a masculine militarized space. And because it's a public space, we've imported all the values of patriarchy and just placed it right here, which means that you and I might expect comments on this video. We might receive beautiful, delightful messages from men who might be so deeply hurt by the words that are coming out from us. I'd say bring it on, guys. Anyway, that aside, we've really internalized so much of violence in our offline public spaces that it has normalized so much of the violence that we bring into our spaces. And when I say we, I don't mean you and me or feminists, but I mean humanity. And so the internet, just like the offline spaces, has also found its divisions on caste lines, religious lines, gender lines, being the biggest domino, but even in terms of accessibility. So the internet has become a space of gatekeeping. You see this as a public space, but we've begun to gatekeep here as well. So those are some of the things that I've noticed as a very big sort of downside of it all. But I don't want to sort of gloss over the fact that women and non-binary people have been phenomenal in really fighting a lot of these things. They shouldn't, they do not have to. No system should exist that makes that the norm for them. In spite of it, we've endured, right? Like we've been there every day, showing up day in and day out, no matter whether we've received an unsolicited picture on our Instagram, or we've received ruthless statements, or we've been doxxed. We still show up. The fact is that we do that. Now, coming to the second piece, you talked about SRHR in conflict zones. Now, this is a very difficult area to talk about without really acknowledging that anything that happens in peacetime is amplified manifold in wartime. Not only because there is no security sector system at place, but also because the values that have been normalized in peacetime become the values on which they act in conflict time. So where you have women's bodies being treated as sites of male lust, male entitlement, cishet male lust, cishet male entitlement, that is amplified manifold in conflict when it is used, where sexual violence is used in a systematic manner to carry out genocide, ethnic cleansing, and other forms of war crimes. Now we see this, we're actually in the middle of what looks like a genocide and ethnic cleansing in Tigray and South Sudan. We're also seeing sexual violence being used as a war crime and as torture in Russia against Ukrainian women, which is not to mean that the opposite is not happening also, right? Like there are male soldiers on both sides of the battle. There are several instances of sexual violence in armed conflict that speak about how it's happened on both sides. So this is something I want to place on record, because women across the lines, no matter what their stake in a conflict are vulnerable to it. And for anybody who's interested, some shameless self-plugging here, but we're coming out with the CRSV Observatory, which actually documents cases of conflict-related sexual violence world over. So one of the bigger challenges, so a little bit of unpacking before I get into why SRHR and lack of resources is a big disadvantage in conflict zones. Women are carefully targeted for ethnic cleansing and genocide through rape, particularly, and sexual violence that prevent pregnancies, basically to erase a bloodline. So when a community is targeted for their ethnicity or their identity with the intent of the enemy wanting to erase them, they target women so they can't get pregnant. And by extension, they also target non-binary people who menstruate, because they don't differentiate between the fact that a person's identity or self-determination is a certain thing. To them, that's a vessel that can reproduce. So you see the reduction of the body to a function of a single organ, notwithstanding that the mind will determine whether that organ should function that way or not, right? Do I want to conceive a child? No, that is not at all part of this. So that is one major reason why conflict-related sexual violence is such a carefully created weapon. Now, while that is happening, there is also magnitudes of other forms of violence that are not systematic. Domestic violence increases, forced marriage increases, wife beating, marital rape, all these things continue to increase, but are not documented as conflict-related sexual violence in systemic numbers. And these things happen because men suspect their wives of their purity. They expect their wives to reproduce the bloodline that they want to preserve. There is also a lot of frustration, and there's opportunistic rape happening as well. So this part of the narrative is oftentimes swept away when we're talking about systemic campaigning, right? Now, in both situations, the breakdown of security sector, healthcare sector, and additional forms of emergency sector support, that enables the pursuit of such violence. Now, Zoom, what have you done to me? Aisha, did I freeze? I'm so sorry.
No, you're back.
So I'll just double back a little bit. Everything is easier. So in a conflict zone, the breakdown of multiple sectors, whether that's the security sector, the regular public health sector, as well as the emergency support sector, enables such violence. And the enabling of such violence automatically means that you have women being forced to conceive, non-binary people who menstruate being forced to conceive without any access to contraception. Now, this is damaging and devastating because there are implications for this. Because when women and non-binary people are forced to conceive, two implications. One, there is a sense of an imposed burden for life. That need not necessarily be borne by the woman if she chooses not to, which is understandable, but it's an economic burden to raise a child. It's a social burden because if she's not raising the child, it falls on the state to take care of the child. So the breakdown of society is massive. For a non-binary person, it is this plus dysphoria, the burden of dysphoria, because their body is being forced to act or to do things that don't align with their gender identity. Now imagine the mental health trauma that's offering for both of them. Now, we have something called the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which started with Resolution 1325 at the United Nations in 2000. Now, this resolution has been followed up with 9 more resolutions, and resolutions 2467 and 2493 came up under the Trump administration. Now, what does that mean? You know where I'm getting that. Now, both these resolutions wanted to specifically talk about sexual and reproductive health rights of women in conflict zones. You had countries that sponsored these resolutions of the Security Council saying, include attention to this. But the US threatened to veto 2493 on the ground that mentioned sexual and reproductive health rights and refused to offer room for that term. Now, this implication is the first point to think about. The second point is what they've done with Roe versus Wade. Now, if anybody thinks that these are implications for women in the United States, they are super deluded. Now, the US is a massive aid maker. And if you've been following the way the US has done its soft policy and aid making since the time of the Cold War, soft power is one of the significant ways in which they peddle these things. So if we have an Americanized way of thinking, dressing, eating, looking at particular brands or role models or whatever, it's because this soft power is alive. So think of how much information warfare we're going to sit on in the future if this is what is going to be their norm. And also think of how They may hold countries that need that money from their aid systems at ransom for abolishing the freedom of women to abort if they need to. Which means that should a day come where, heaven forbid, but should a day come when we're fully dependent on US aid, heaven forbid that a country's nonprofit sector thrives on aid from the United States, then we're looking at the withholding of that aid if there is any programming to support women's abortion or sexual reproductive health rights. So we're looking at a new form of colonialism with the old message just remixed and rebottled and rebranded and sent down to us. To me, unraveling that, and I know Aisha, I'm derailing so much, I apologize.
But no, this is very interesting. Please carry on. Yeah.
So to me, unraveling that will come from a feminist foreign policy, a return to the way women do leadership. I refuse to believe feminist leadership is just more women in positions of power. It is a form of leadership that women have exercised and existed in since time immemorial. If you look at the indigenous wisdom in the world, wherever, First Nations, India, the Adivasi community in India, Aboriginal communities in Australia, in Scandinavian Europe, there, and so many parts of Africa and Latin America, you will find narratives of women who have resisted colonialism, who have practiced food sovereignty, who have practiced keeping their communities together with the most beautifully established forms of leadership. It is not about one man pursuing a campaign of religious megalomania targeting people across the board for no rhyme or reason. It's about leading from grassroots up. And until that arrives and the colonial Westphalian state system in the world takes a deep, hard look at how it has failed, how its existence is so deeply entrenched on the blood it has spilled, we will not change.
Yeah, absolutely. I was listening into everything that you were saying. I think, other than the fact that I don't think we are absolutely derailed from the conversation. I think this is what the conversation is, just unpacking all of the, the politics of it. And I'll just start from the beginning, just a few points that I wanted to add on to what you said with regards to, just the medium now that the online medium now that we have, and using it and its sort of advantages as well as disadvantages. So in that sense, I think one of the biggest advantages has been in terms of, telemedicine abortion, for example. Like in COVID, I think that was a lifesaver for a lot of women. And I think it continues to be for a lot of women who cannot, who have restrictive laws or, don't have any other sort of support by their local policymakers or government. I think online medium has been the one that, that they resort to. I think so in that sense, the advantages, that has been a very big advantage. But at the same time, like you said, the disadvantage has been that then the risk of the safety or privacy of the person who are providing the services, who are providing the information in those same very, risky contexts, like, countries with laws and, putting people in jail for accessing abortion or providing the services. So I think the balance is there, and I think the balance we need to, as human rights activists, I feel it is the responsibility lies more on us, because we use the medium to sort of share more information and reach out to, but we also need to be aware of, what our actions can also put someone else at risk. So being aware of that. So I think while using online mediums is just something that, we have to battle up, as long as, because we cannot expect the makers of these platforms, which are against cisgendered heterosexual men who constantly, who are not even aware and are sort of more ignorant about the implications or consequences of their, the apps that they create, that it might have on people of marginalized identities, especially on women as well. If that these big tech giants, we cannot expect them to take all of the accountability and responsibility. Until then, till that happens, we have to take the responsibility for that. So just wanted to share that. And coming to your point about, SRHR and abortion services in conflict areas, especially, I feel like you mentioned, of course, women, any issue or any problem that exists sort of in peacetime is amplified much more in terms of, in a times of crisis, be it a war, as you said, or be it even a calamity like a health calamity that we've been dealing with. Again, in the past 2 years, we saw how women were sort of forced marriages is something that happened even during the pandemic, right? Child marriages was something that increased. Again, non-binary people, their safety spaces were sort of taken away from them, because for many, household is the most unsafe space for many people. So yeah, so that was something, and even within that, we see even in conflict times as well, I feel it is the marginalized that suffer the most. Even in that, so that intersection also exists in in those times as well. And regarding the last point about US politics, I think the hegemony, the soft power that you talked about, I think that's something that we look up to, but really we need to question now. We've looked up to it for a long time, but now we're sort of now realizing that how problematic their outlook towards, at one end they're talking about climate change and they're talking about all of these progressive ideals and liberals and freedom of speech and all of that, but at the same time they're restricting freedom of a lot of other identities and countries. Like we saw what happened in Afghanistan as well, and the way sort of the US left. And a lot of people assume that things will change with Joe Biden coming into power, or that Trump was the worst one. But that's when your ideals and your foundations are sort of not that clarity doesn't exist, that understanding that doesn't exist regarding race, regarding gender. It's still very deep rooted, right? Like even when you look at India, something that's very deep rooted, like caste, we haven't addressed that. And now, no matter how much secularism or communalism we keep talking about, or gender we keep talking about, that Brahmanical patriarchy also is coming from the same roots as well. So yeah, US politics has had a very, very devastating influence. And even when Trump was there, or when the global gag rule, that I think we have seen what kind of an impact that had in terms of funding for organizations who are working in countries in Asia, in India, in Pakistan, in the subcontinent especially. And it's not just these funders sort of limiting people's ability to talk about abortion, but also like you said, holding them at ransom, saying that we might not even provide you money for any other work if you're talking about abortion randomly. Not even if you're not talking about abortion with our money, if you're taking money from someone else and doing a whole another campaign, but still we will not give you money for the one thing that we are giving you for. So it's just sort of like it is it does have a devastating impact. And it's unfortunate that we sort of have to depend on the aids from US. But even what's the alternative as well, right? When then you have the European Union, or then their sort of but again, over there also, their ideals on Palestine, or women in Palestine, is something that needs to be questioned, or their outlook there, when they're constantly questioning US's war politics and all that. But then your ideals are also not that clear as well. I mean, we saw what happened during Ukraine, and the whole world was sort of on like, oh my God, it's a World War III and all of that. And we actually had journalists saying that, oh my God, this is not Afghanistan, or this is not Middle East, this is Europe we're talking about. So, I mean, these sort of statements, and not just one or two, but like many people came out, people of positions and power. So, I mean, that sort of understanding, if that the post-colonial ideology still exists in that way, so we can, if we don't look at things in a more broader level, I think we will keep going the same path, and we might not see the changes that we are wishing to see if we don't question these things now, and hold them accountable, hold the ones in power accountable.
I mean, it really takes a European country to face a challenge for the world to sit up and take notice. Memories of women facing sexual violence when the British, when the French, when the Germans, when they all left their colonies, it was just collateral damage. So yeah, I was just agreeing with that. But yeah,
absolutely. Great. So I'll move on to my next question, which is related to the app that you've created, and I think I'm sure it was a lifesaver for a lot of people. And to give a bit of background, I'm sure you can share a bit more in detail. The app was basically support. It was a one-stop for women to who are facing violence, domestic violence, physical, mental violence, for them to go on that app and look at the support centers that are available. What are the steps that they can take? So I think in that sense, it was a great tool for women to have some sort of help that they can reach out to and write in their hands. But then at the same time, my question to you is, while the initiative, of course, is brilliant, my question is that how did you manage to make sure that the safety or privacy of those women who are reaching out to you for help, their privacy is not hampered, or their information is not it does not reach into the hands of like maybe their family members, or how do you ensure their privacy at that time? And also, we have a lot of our youth champions and country advocacy networks who use online media and platforms for keep talking about safe abortion and sharing information on abortion pills and where they can access it, which can be risky in a lot of areas as well. So are there any tips, while using online mediums? A lot of us use the, the available ones like, Google, Facebook and all of that. But are there any other tools that, you would recommend for safe abortion rights activists that they can use? Or and just a bit about, making sure about how they can ensure their own safety and privacy while being online.
Well, there was quite a bit around that. So I want to start by telling you that Saahas was one of the formative tools that helped me see how even a tool that is intentioned to be all-encompassing and intended to reach as many women as possible is also limited. And I want to start by the limitations of it all first before I move to the privacy piece of it, because I think this is very fundamental to any thinking that anyone wants to bear in mind while maybe reinventing this approach. The first being the fact that this was a tool in English, which means that very few women are going to be able to, and non-binary people are going to be able to access in the grander scheme of things. More of us don't speak English or read or consume English as do people that don't. That being the first. The second point is also just the fact that this is a tool that requires a smartphone or access of a tool that is smart enough, whether that's a smart device or whichever way. So the challenge then becomes, how do we make sure that this translates to the last mile? And that was one of the first places where privacy became the big question. Now, to start with, the app was not in any way oriented towards gathering any information. So which means that you could log in from anywhere and I will not know. All that would log in is somebody logged in. And won't even tell me, how long they spent, none of that. So I was not gathering granular data, which meant also that this would not be a funded initiative because no donor will put their money when they can't see what they want to see as numbers, right? And I'm fine with that. I was okay with doing this on my own money and effort and all of that. Now, that being the first point, the second piece around privacy then became about people who wanted to breach the app barrier and reach out to me personally, which meant that either they didn't have the time or the wherewithal to look through the app, or they just wanted somebody who could give them one or two resources from the app. So people would reach out to me on email, Instagram, Twitter. I think, Facebook. I was on Facebook as well at that time. So all of these avenues then became sites for very, very difficult conversations where they would spill their heart's content for the first time to someone. And I was looking at many messages on a daily basis filled with very painful stories. Now, this then also made me realize that it's great that people are finding that trust in me, but how can I nurture that? How can I hold that? So personally, what I started doing was at the end of the conversation, I would ask them if they would like me to retain this conversation as evidence on their behalf. And if that was the case, would they be comfortable with me converting this into a PDF and saving it in a locked folder in my device? Few people did that, especially when they wanted evidence to go to a court of law. So I would then meticulously draw out a screenshot or several screenshots and document them as PDFs. And when they tell me to destroy it, I would destroy it. Some people just said, no, thank you for the help, and I don't need this documented. I would delete the entire chat and send the screenshot of the empty deleted window to them, so they know that this is no longer on any record with me. So that those two things, or between these two things, finding a creative solution every now and then, for instance, holding on to it until they felt that it was right to destroy, for example, emerged. Now, these are not best practices. These are not ideal. These are not the way to go. The only way to go is for the system to be better and not to think that it can weaponize data or information. That is a utopian, but yeah.
These are mechanisms that we are developing to survive. I mean, these are like you keep saying that, we shouldn't have to, there shouldn't even be an app, like there shouldn't be a felt the need to have an app like that, and so just one more question following up on that, because you mentioned that, a lot of people, even having a smartphone is like a privilege for a lot of people. And like you said, that the fact that it was in English did miss out on a lot of people as well. So I just wanted to ask that in terms of how many people were you able to, help, and what was the response like from people trying to understand?
Thank you for asking that, Aisha. What I used to do at the time in terms of recording the number of people I worked with, it was actually a simple pen and paper model. I used to actually write down in a notebook, no names, just someone reached out for medical help. And so it used to just be recorded in the notebook. And by the end of last year, it was 46,000 odd, give or take a few above. And one of the bigger challenges that, sort of grappling with help seeking that I've noticed is really just in terms of how few resources there are and how many people there are in need of that help, and how much system and society do to really muzzle people. At all points, the whole goal has always been, yes, we'll say that there are these resources available, there are these mechanisms available to support survivors, but we will make it hard for people to access it. We will go the extra mile to make sure that anybody who wants to access it will simply either not have the means to do so, or will just be stigmatized or prevented, or just typically, giving people a hard time to really exist as a functional human being with the desire to get help, to get back on track, to feel better, to really do away with the challenges that society places on it. And this is, I think, the biggest problem of patriarchy, right? Like there's been this whole tendency of being the supplier of pain and placing the emotional labor on the person itself to avoid succumbing to that pain, which is just, at the end of the day, it's just, it reflects on how much we have failed as a people, as it were. So coming to the point, I think you had specifically asked about what would I suggest for people who are seeking this kind of support in a place with strict abortion laws. The one thing I would definitely place my 100% faith on, goodness, is a sense of community. If you can find people like you, or people who have been in a place that you are in at the moment, and build a sense of community to pay forward, that is an act of resistance. Basically, all I'm saying is if you show up for yourself and for others, it's a big act of resistance and subversion. What that means then is to create networks and nurture networks by acknowledging the intersectional lines on which you have to mobilize. And in that mobilization, deeply acknowledge that your life is very different from the person who is seeking help, even though you may have had a trajectory of help seeking in the past. So that is one piece. Now, censorship and surveillance is at the moment, I think, more than inevitable. I'm not saying that it's inevitable because it should happen. I'm saying it's inevitable because of the scale at which it's happening. There's a difference there, which means that anything that we want to buy online, if I want to buy a menstrual cup, it is recorded. If I want to use an app to record my period and track it, it is recorded. And all of this is ultimately going to be weaponized against me, because why do you want this much data? You're not doing anything to benefit me. If you're not, then you're here to target me with it. Which goes back to the fact that anything that's offered to you for free or for a reasonable price means that you are the customer. You are the commodity, sorry, not the customer. You are the commodity yourself. So I want to really think through this in the long term, but I'm sowing this seed for anybody who wants to think through this with me. Can we feminize, I'm not saying the word right, can we be feminist about the internet? Can we create a feminist internet? Can we create feminist mobilizations across borders and be intersectional and mindful while doing so, in ways that then subvert the patriarchy once and for all?